John Judge, a researcher, once said that in the United States, you're allowed to see everything but know nothing. Today, we are going to break that rule and speak truth to power. To help us with this task, we have with us an important activist, thinker, and author, Howie Hawkins. And Howie has been active in movements for peace and justice, the environment, and independent progressive politics since the late 1960s when he was in high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. Born in San Francisco, California in 1952, Hawkins was raised in a multiracial neighborhood in nearby San Mateo. He became politically active at the age of 12 when he witnessed how the multiracial Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was denied recognition at the 1964 Democratic Convention. He eventually began protesting against the Vietnam War, the military draft, and racial discrimination. After graduating from high school, he attended Dartmouth College. A former Marine, he helped organize opposition to the Vietnam War and was co-founder of the Anti-Nuclear Clamshell Alliance in 1976. He was co-founder of the Green Party of the United States in 1984. After attending Dartmouth College in the early 1970s, Howie worked as a carpenter in New England and helped start up a construction workers cooperative that specialized in solar and wind energy installations. Howie moved to Syracuse in 1991 to be the director of Common Works, a federation of cooperatives working for an economy that is cooperatively owned, democratically controlled, and ecologically sustained. In the years between 1993 and 2005, Howie has run for public office for over 20 times, as he has sought offices ranging from Syracuse Common Council to the U.S. Senate and Governor of New York. Recently, he ran for Governor of New York, and he got 5% of the vote, thereby giving the Green Party of New York ballot access for all offices in New York. He is a member of the Teamsters Local 317 and is active in the National Teamsters Rank and File Reform Caucus, Teamsters for a Democratic Union. Howie, until recently, worked unloading trucks and rail cars in UPS. Howie's articles on social theory, cooperative economics, and independent politics have appeared in many publications, including Against the Current, Green Politics, International Socialist Review, New Politics, Peace and Democracy News, Peaceworks, Resist, Society and Nature, and Z Magazine. He is the editor of the Independent Politics, the Green Party Strategy Debate, Haymarket Books, 2006. Today he is going to speak to us about eco-socialism and independent politics. Let's give Howie Hawkins, an enthusiastic Green Party of Connecticut, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. What I'm going to do today is talk about the two campaigns I've run for governor and the one I'm preparing to run for this year. So I ran in 2010 and 2014, and now the Greens, I really don't have a choice. The state committee just basically said, this is your task. Now that you're retired, you can devote 100% to it. So, and we're running a little differently this year, and that's why the title is Ecological Socialism and Independent Politics. In 2010 and 2014, and basically I've run over 20 times, we've campaigned on immediate demands, things that the people think make sense right now, that the Greens support. Implicit in that, for me, was my socialist perspective. But we didn't run on an ism. People don't vote for isms. They vote basically with their guts. Is this person like me? Are they on my side? And you can help shape that feeling by the policies and demands you make. They're not so interested in, a whole new system or philosophy. But this year we're facing this anti-Trump big blue wave. And most progressives are going right into the Democratic Party. We're having defections from the Green Party. And, Trump is terrible, but the Democrats are no solution. And so what we want to do in 2018 is different, is talk about ecological socialism. Our messaging to the broad public will be around our demands. In fact, I'm just going to, why don't you pass this around. It's a draft of our platform summary. So you can see the kind of issues we're raising in New York. But we also want to say to particularly progressives and to Greens and independent socialists that we need system change, not just a new set of people running the same old system. If we're going to really solve pending planetary environmental collapse and the crisis of nuclear weapons, we're on a hair trigger. The doomsday machine, as Daniel Ellsberg calls it, is hanging over our heads. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists now has the clock at 2 minutes to midnight. Only once before, in 1953, was it at that level. And underneath that, capitalism's got back to normalcy. It did about 40 years ago, but people are just beginning to realize that. Because we had a sort of golden age between the 30s and early 70s, when it looked like it could concede reforms and make life passable for most of us. And that's just not the case. And so the normal operation of capitalism polarizes wealth and income, and the rich are getting richer and the rest of us are getting left behind. These are the kind of points, by having a systemic analysis and a projection of our alternative, that we want to appeal to those progressives to say, you're drowning, or this big blue wave, anti-Trump wave, you're going to drown in it because the Democratic Party is no solution. So we're going to try to throw some of them a lifeline and build a stronger core, because I think what we're facing in the next 4 years, or 2.5 years, is, the majority of progressives and the country, it's about 2 to 1, they're going to bring back a Democratic House and Senate, unless the Democrats spoil it for themselves, which they can do. Although Trump is unbelievably bad and he's losing his own people. And then they're going to get the presidency, and then we're going to be basically back where we were at the end of the Obama regime, when, constant wars, nuclear modernization, they resisted even the most modest action on climate, and wealth and income kept polarizing. So that's the situation we're in. The immediate demands we ran on in both of those campaigns are, most of them are still on our platform, but one of them we won. That was a ban on fracking. And we gave voice to the anti-fracking movement. Public schools, we want full funding and curricula, which means an end to high-stakes testing, so we get a whole-rounded education. And integrated public schools. New York has the most segregation of any schools in the country. There's a new report out 50 years after the Kerner report by the Milton Eisenhower Institute. Fred Harris, who used to be a senator from Oklahoma, a populist candidate for president in 1976, he's one of the co-authors of that. And we call the high-stakes testing the test, punish, privatize, and segregate agenda. And it's basically, we've got a strong opt-out movement where the parents opt out of the test. About 20% of the students don't take the test in the state. And they're opposing the hedge fund guys in Wall Street who are really big on the high-stakes testing, because that punishes students, teachers in schools in high-poverty districts. They're going to score lower. Because we know one thing, your scores on standardized tests correlate strongly with your class background. And so they use those tests to rationalize privatization and making a whole bunch of money off the, all the fraud, waste, and abuse in this charter school industry. And in the 2014 election, the statewide teachers were neutral. They didn't take a position because Cuomo was really bad. The Republican wasn't much better. And, they were friendly to me behind the scenes, but they weren't going to stick their neck out for Cuomo to take shots at them. But 6 teachers union locals endorsed us. And it really got the statewide teachers, because somebody slipped us on the QT a list of all the local union presidents. So my running mate, Brian Jones, who was an open socialist, he's a member of the International Socialist Organization. He's a school teacher in Harlem at the time. And we wrote a letter to all the teachers union presidents. So we got a lot of meetings out of that. Oh man, the statewide teachers, their lawyers were after us. Where'd you get that list? I want a big investigation. I didn't know. I have plausible deniability because I don't know how they got the list. All I know is we had the list and I helped write the letter. So that was a big issue, and it's going to be a big issue in this campaign. Guaranteed health care through a single public payer health insurance. That's 1 vote short in the state Senate. That's going to be a big issue this year. $15 minimum wage. We campaigned in 2010 and 2014 on that. Cuomo's come part way on it. 100% clean energy by 2030. Progressive tax reform. And because Cuomo went after the public unions and has been such a austerity budget hawk, he was not liked by the public unions. So at least we got interviews with the Public Employee Federation, which is basically the state white-collar employees. AFSCME, which is CSEA in New York, played footsie and never did interview us. I think they, again, were afraid Cuomo would get back at them. The transit workers in New York, who, interesting union, there are a lot of factions fighting, they did interview us. Not the Teamsters. They're kind of top down under Hoffman. I'm a troublemaker. And so they didn't want to interview their Teamster candidate. We called for public banking, expansion of public housing, more money into transit, a public energy corporation for the state, public broadband, so we can reach those areas that don't have digital access, which are both in the rural areas and in the inner cities particularly. So we're talking about social ownership of utilities, but we weren't labeling it socialism so much. And then a lot of reforms on, you can see them on, there's still what's on that sheet. We got Andrew Cuomo on the 40 Thieves. He's got $30 million in his account. There's a big article in the New York Times last November, and the headline said, Cuomo, master of the $50,000 a plate dinner, fundraising dinner, and the subtitle was, he has no small donors, and it's true. He had like one or two under $200, which is the definition of small donors. When I ran against him in 2014, I had more donors than he did. Problem was, my average donor was $35, and his was $3,500. So, and he had people going, we got a loophole called the LLC loophole. The maximum a corporation or an individual can give is $37,500. That was in 2014. It's higher now. And so these real estate guys, guys like Donald Trump, would, for every property they have an LLC. So one guy who just passed at age 100 gave him $1 million for that campaign. And, a lot of others did. So, it's a farce to say that we have any kind of campaign finance laws in New York. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind, and we've tried to emphasize. The Democratic Party is in no way progressive. It's part of a two-party oligarchy, two-party system of corporate rule. And, it was mentioned in the introduction how, I kind of got into this in 1964 when not only did the Freedom Democrats get denied in Atlantic City at the convention, but I was living in California, and Ronald Reagan is campaigning against a fair housing law that just act to get it repealed, called the Rumsfeld Fair Housing Act. And so I'm saying the Republicans are racist, watch the Democrats, they're racist. And I asked myself, where's my party? At age 12. I later learned that John Lewis had that line in his speech at the March on Washington the year before. And my party turned out to be the Peace and Freedom Party. And it wasn't just my neighborhood, it was my family. I got cousins who are the children of a Japanese war bride, and they married into Filipino and Hawaiian families. So coming up, in California, there was a lot of anti-Japanese, they're N-words for Japanese as well as black folks. And they came off white folks' lips, together when, my school would play white schools. And so it was personal. And then, the Democrats were a big disappointment. And then Johnson ran as a peace candidate and then escalated into Vietnam. So when Peace and Freedom came around, when I'm 14 years old, I got registrations from, the older people and started handing them to adults. Register in this party. And they'd say, son, why do you care? I said, I don't want to get drafted for this stupid war in Vietnam. And they'd say, oh, don't worry about it. It'll be over by the time you're old enough to get drafted. Well, I got drafted. And I enlisted in the Marine Corps and continued to organize against the war, which is a whole other story I won't even get into, but there's a lot of anecdotes there that are fun. I guess that's one way of putting it. But so that was my entry into adulthood. Now, as I leave adulthood, the Democratic Party, led by George Miller, who is the congressman representing Richmond, California, which is supposed to be so progressive, and Concord, a founder of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, added to the omnibus spending bill at the end of 2015 a rider that said multi-employer pension funds are no longer protected under ERISA, the Employment Retirement Security Act, from cuts. So that enabled the teachers fund I'm in New York State, to cut my pension 20% with approval of the Treasury Department. Happened last September. And I actually, when I first started working 17 years ago at UPS, my projected pension at age 62 retirement would have been $2,400 a month. What I will be getting, my official, I was on vacation days and whatnot, I officially retired at the end of the week before when we're in. And I'll get my first pension check in April. And it will be $1,060, which is, about 40% of what, what I planned on. So thank you, Democratic Party. And that passed, Miller introduced it, asked for a voice vote, bipartisan approval, and they cut our pensions. And, we were counting on that as a promise. So, in between, let me just recount a few of the things. And these are the kind of things we got to talk to progressives about, because there's a real illusion about what the Democratic Party is. One of the things I did beside anti-nuclear, which, by the way, it was Carter, when we proved to the Regional Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or as we like to call it, NRC, nobody really cares, that there was no evacuation from the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant site from Hampton Beach across the bay, and that those people would be fried if there was an accident because they couldn't get out in time. And Carter just took that from the regional and gave it to the three people he appointed at the top board of the NRC, and they approved Seabrook. And so that was the Democratic Party in that fight. And then there was the anti-apartheid struggle. So we got really involved in that after the Soweto uprising in 1976. And who came into office but Jimmy Carter and Andrew Young, Diane McHenry, and Carl McCall, who's a big New York politician, who were in the UN office promoting this constructive engagement in South Africa. So the Democratic Party, we were fighting the Democratic Party. We later fought Reagan and beat him in 85 when we finally got sanctions. It was 86. But that's the Democratic Party. And then there's the whole question of imperialism and militarism. It's worth remembering that when Carter came in, Ford had cut the military budget post-Vietnam, and Carter raised it higher than Ford budget projections wanted. And of course, Reagan escalated that. And then when Bill Clinton came in, there was a flattening and a little bit downturn under Bush 1 after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, and we were talking about a peace dividend. And Carter raised the military budget above the projections of Bush. And now we got Obama, who just authorized $1 trillion modernization of our nuclear forces. And the Pentagon, with Trump's approval, now says we're going to make the conventional and nuclear forces closer together so we can use tactical nukes in conventional war, which is, we're already on a hair trigger. I mean, once there's an exchange, they're doomsday machines. That's what's in, Daniel Ellsberg's new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, which is his second Pentagon papers. He planned to release at the time. It's a long story, but it's out now. He had to reconstruct it because he put the papers in a ditch and a flood blew them away, and so he had to reconstruct all the stuff he'd, all that classified information. But it just came out. It's scary as hell. But that's what we're hanging under. And it was Obama that talked about we need to have nuclear disarmament, but that's not what he did. And let's not forget, just on the militarism thing, it was the Carter Doctrine that got us into the Middle East. I was in the Marine Corps in the early 70s, and the thing that I remember of all the things I was told was an article in Leatherneck, which is this magazine for officer candidates and officers. And they talked about the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, being the Archimedes point of world geopolitics. You control that, you can lever power everywhere. You can have, from a base there, you can hit Tokyo, you can hit Paris, London, Moscow, and the oil is there. And I'm thinking, man, that's where we're going. If we're not going back to Vietnam, which I first thought when Nixon won the landslide, then he got tangled in Watergate. I thought, man, we're going to fight for oil. And sure enough, Clinton got us in there. Well, Bush got us in there with the first Gulf War, and then Clinton stayed there with the free fly zones and the sanctions. We were at war with Iraq that whole time. And then we get into the 2000s, and the Democrats, that was a totally bipartisan invasion and occupation of Iraq. There was a few little dissenting votes. When we first did a head count, there were 25 of the extreme left wing of the Congress. And we lobbied like hell in 2003. You called us the world's second superpower. There was massive demonstrations all over the world. We got up to 125 to vote against it, but really only about 25 of them were with us. The other 100 were covering their political asses in their districts. And then in that whole period, the Democrats, Pelosi made sure that the debate on the supplemental war funds, remember that? They weren't in the Pentagon budget. There was supplemental to fight those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. She made sure that was resolved in the spring before it became a campaign issue. I told Ralph Nader that when I asked him to review the introduction to this book, Independent Politics, and he didn't believe that. So there's a foot-long footnote. You can go chapter by chapter, year by year on how the Democrats did that. So that's the real Democratic Party. And I think, as we talk to people in elections and between elections and the other activities we're doing, we've got to get them to face these facts. That is the nature of the Democratic Party. And basically what we've got is a big fight over social issues and cultural values between the Democrats and Republicans. But there's a basic bipartisan consensus on economic and foreign policy. And that policy is not in the interest of most of us. So when we talk about independent politics, we're not just talking about independent candidates not having the Democratic or Republican label, at least for those of us on the left. We're talking about a mass membership party that unites different sectors of the working class around a common program. What we got right now is basically siloed, separated movements around constituencies and single issues. And you have digitalized top-down mobilization. So people are looking at their computers more than they're looking at each other and talking to each other. So that you have, the fat cats who support Democrats putting up, funding these groups like MoveOn.org, and people looking at their phone to find out where the next demo is, or the next letter they're supposed to write, or the petition they're supposed to click. And there's no grassroots organization where people get together and try to figure out what are we going to do. You got staffs that in the end are funded by people like George Soros and Peter Lewis and those kind of people. And that channels people into the Democratic Party because that's where their politics are at. So we also have a working class, which, depending on your count, is 60 to 80% of us that are wage workers who don't have any autonomy or very little autonomy on the job. We basically take orders. We work as directed. And but we're divided, obviously, by race in this country, which is something we've got to overcome, but also by occupational divisions. We have public sector and private sector workers. Take the pension issue. Where was my union when they were cutting pensions in New York State? We have 6 tiers now. They keep getting worse. Where were the public unions when this rider to the omnibus spending bill? They're all fighting for their own members. They're basically business unions, not movement unions for the whole labor movement. And you got union members and non-union members. And, the non-union members resent the union members and their benefits. Especially public union workers, because, they're all paying all these taxes. And then the union people, not too happy with the non-union people, or see them as competitors, like in the building trades. They try to limit the number of people that can get into the union, especially if they're black or brown or Indian in New York State. And he's in the Green Party, a steel worker who, he's a structural steel expert, worked on the Bay Bridge and Golden Gate Bridge, and moved back, I'm getting off into a story, but, Richard Oates was a Mohawk, this guy's cousin, who led the occupation of Alcatraz and led to the whole American Indian movement. He came back to Syracuse and, went to the local ironworkers, and they said, "Oh, you don't want to join our local. You join the local over in Utica because there are more Indians over there. You'd be more comfortable." But whenever they needed structural steel, because all they mostly did was rebar, they'd call this guy, have him there so they could do the job. That's the kind of, problem that we have. Big business, small business, very different kind of work situations. And, in small businesses, the owners tend to work alongside the workers, so there's a different kind of relationship. And then you've got public workers and people are institutionalized in the criminal justice and welfare system. So there's a lot of people. And they don't see themselves as in the same class of folks. So we need a party where people can get together and strategize how to get together across geographically segregated by class and race or occupational division and race to find their common interests. And that takes an organization. It's not going to be done by move on from the top down with their mobilizations, over the internet. And so that's really why we need an organized mass party. We also need a party, not just a pressure group on the Democratic Party, which is what Bernie Sanders is trying to do. Because if we're talking about an alternative, we need an identity. So people see us as an alternative, not part of the Democratic Party. They were the liberal wing of it. And because we're talking about basic changes, and we need an oppositional and alternative identity. We need an organization so we can do political education. This is something that a party should be doing. I think the Greens are weak on it. We need much improvement. So we have historical perspective. So just take where we're at right now. I gave you kind of a perspective on where I think the next few years will go. And if you look at this book, tied in my book, this is about what happened in the aftermath of Nader in 2000 and the backlash against him by liberals and how it scared a lot of the Greens who pushed Nader away. And all the arguments we're going to have now in the next period, we had back then. So, you can see what we went through before, and, the old saying, those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. So we need that. We also need to analyze the power structure. Who really has the power? A lot of people really don't have a very good conception. It's like my congressman's got the power, right? They don't think about, who's behind the congressman? And, the financing and, the corporate concentration of power. Corporations exercise power outside the electoral system by their investment decisions. They don't like what a reform government's doing. They go on a strike of capital. They don't invest. Take Dennis Kucinich in Cleveland. The capitalists in that metro area wanted to privatize the, I think it's called Cleveland Light, their electric system. And Kucinich said no. So the bank said, okay, we're just not going to roll over your $13 million in ongoing debt. If you're a city, your revenues are up and down, you need some credit. And they said, we're just cutting you off, Jack. And he didn't get reelected. He was the boy mayor of Cleveland. And they brought in Voinovich, a Republican who eventually became senator, but then the economy tanked, interest rates skyrocketed in the 70s, and they couldn't afford to privatize it. And then they came back and looked in the 90s and realized somebody did the calculations. Kucinich had saved the city hundreds of millions of dollars. And that kind of rehabilitated him. He got on the council and the Congress. But see, what happened in Cleveland was the capitalists decided who would be mayor without even having an election by basically saying we're going to undermine Kucinich. So that's the kind of analysis we've got to educate our people and then take to the public. And, okay, I'm talking about having a party where you can actually go to a local meeting, meet real people, and talk things through. The Democrats and Republicans are not that way. They are the old-style party that goes back to the 19th century. The first, just take England. You had a parliament, but the parties were top-down affairs where you had caucuses, Tories and Whigs, and then to mobilize it, have rich people give them money, and then they mobilize people to vote for them from the top down. That's what the Democrats and Republicans are. There's no local Democratic or Republican meetings you go to talk about policy and actions and what's going on in the world. What happened in those committee meetings is you talk about who's going to run, who are we going to designate, who's going to do the petitions, and how we get the vote out on election day. And you want to talk about other stuff, take it to the bar afterwards. It's not part of the Democratic or Republican Party structures. So these parties are not just top-down run by the political leaders. And they're not just pro-capitalist parties. They are actually capitalist enterprises or even markets because candidates are entrepreneurs and they have a coterie of staff with them, at the higher levels. And they are seeking investors. and the fat cats sit back and listen and decide who to invest in. And then those with the most money get in the primaries and win the primaries. So the candidates are pre-selected by the money. And so even if you get on the committees, by the time the candidates get to the committees, the ones that are quote unquote viable have already been picked by the fat cats. Meanwhile, some people say, well, I'm registered in this party or that party in those states that keep registration. Or in the other states, the open primary states, you grab the ballot of that party when the primary comes in the polling place. And, those people aren't members of anything. They're atomized. They're separated from each other. They don't talk to each other. So that is the nature of parties. In fact, here's an anecdote. The socialists in New York elected 6 members to the state assembly in 1920. And the state assembly refused to seat them. They were subversive. The Bolsheviks had just had a revolution. We're not seating you. We're calling a special election to replace you. And they all got reelected. So they still didn't seat them. And to justify that, I don't know where they got all the staff. There is a 5,000-page tome, which is a interesting study of all the revolutionary, the IWW, the Bolsheviks, the Slovenian socialists, this and anarchists, that. I mean, all over the world. And there's a section on New York State. And right at the beginning it says, the Socialist Party of New York is not a party. It's an organization. Exclamation point, horror. Heavens forbid that the working class got organized. And they point out that was anathema. And that was the justification for excluding these socialists, because they actually were part of a working class organization. And that's what we need to be thinking about achieving. And particularly in this period, because as I said, I think the momentum and the broader, left liberal movement is going to be, we got to get Trump out of there, we got to get the Democrats back in. So I think what we need to be doing at this point is solidifying our core in our education, because I think once the Democrats get back in power, people will see they don't have real solutions, the same problems will be there, and they're going to say, now what? And we're what? And I think that's what we need to prepare ourselves for, and not get discouraged in the next few years just because the trend is not going our way at this point. And so this is background. I talked about 2010 and 2014, about the goals we had. I don't know if I even got to that part. I don't think I did. But the goals we had were to secure a ballot line, and I've explained how we did. To build power, which meant supporting progressive movements, giving them voice, and giving an independent alternative to the Democrats so they couldn't take us for granted. And then build the party itself, organize locals, and in our case that's county organizations. And in 2018 we have a 4th goal, and that is to educate about ecological socialism. So what we're going to do in 2018 is we're still going to lead with these immediate demands that people generally are for. But we're also going to message about how we need to change the system. And there are 2 things about capitalism that we want to make clear. One is, because of competition between firms, every firm's got to grow, increase profits, accumulate capital in order to compete with other firms, or they're going to die. They're going to lose out in the competition. And that imparts a dynamic of blind, relentless growth into the economy that is incompatible with sustainability and ecological balance. So we're on the verge of planetary collapse. You may have heard of these biophysical boundaries that the scientists have identified. And at this point, we are past the boundary. We've breached the boundaries of the limits for carbon in the atmosphere, global warming. Biodiversity is declining due to mass extinctions, and that's a positive feedback loop. We're going to have more mass extinctions, and the less complex the ecosystems are, the more unstable they are, and they tend to collapse. And atmospheric nitrogen depletion. And we're on the verge of passing oceanic phosphorus, ocean acidification, which basically means we're not going to have sea fish or shellfish. Conversion of land surface to cropland, which decreases habitat and biodiversity. Freshwater depletion and ozone depletion. we can't go on with the system we have and survive. So that's one argument. And the other is, due to competition between firms, they all try to minimize their costs, which means keep wages and benefits for working people as low as possible. And every time you go to work, every hour, you get a fixed wage, which is as low as they can make it. And any more value you create, surplus value, goes to the owners. And so, a firm with 100 people, you got 100 people giving their surplus value to the owners, who are a much smaller number. And there are studies, and I could give you the citations, where they figure out, using labor time as the standard, how much surplus value goes to the capitalists. It's about half of the time we work. We get paid for half the time we work, and then the rest goes to the owners. And that, under capitalism, it's normal process of, we call that exploitation, makes the rich richer and the rest of us stuck at the, bare subsistence level, or a little bit above but insecure. So there are no real solutions to the problems of, well, there's one third thing, and that is this competition between capitals who control nation states, who compete for resources, markets, and all kinds of things, creates conditions that can lead to war. And we're in a nuclear age. So with those three problems, there's no solution under capitalism. I think that's the anti-capitalist argument we want to make. So what is the alternative? And I tend to agree with Garl Perowitz, who's thought a lot about this, that we don't know in detail what the alternative is. I mean, there was a lot of projection of what it ought to be in the early 19th century, including by Americans who actually influenced Marx and others in Europe. They were basically the first people who lost their farms or their independent artisanships, crafts, and had to work in factories. And for them, they lost their Republican liberty, because liberty was based on property, which gave you independence from a master, and then you were a free agent in politics. And when you were working for a master, dependent on employment, and also they figured out you were getting exploited, you were no longer a free person. So they called it wage slavery, and they compared it very consciously to chattel slavery in the South. And out of that came the first Working Men's Party, and they had ideas about cooperative production. If you have large-scale production, it's got to be collectively owned cooperatives, so that you get your property rights, your independence from a master, and your political liberty, so you can be a free citizen. That was their philosophy. And that was true throughout the 19th century, through the abolitionists and the first labor movements, the Greenback Labor Party, the Populist Party. That was the way they looked at it in terms of the American political tradition. And, I think there's a value in that we need to recover. But then, Marx said, he's said to have criticized the utopians, and a lot of people say that's because they were projecting the future. And that wasn't what Marx criticized them for. It was really about they were the utopians who thought, like Robert Owen, when he first came over here, who Marx liked of all the utopians the best. He spoke twice before a joint session of Congress, all the Supreme Court justices, outgoing President Monroe and incoming President John Quincy Adams, about socialism in the House of the People, in Congress. Two, long lectures on what this was about. I mean, people were looking for alternatives at that time. Now, Marx said, those people who are benefiting from the system that's evolving are not going to give it to you. You've got to have a force that will do that. That was the working class for Marx. So that was his main criticism of the utopians. And if you read what he criticized, he would criticize some of them for having bad ideas, but some of them for having good ideas. Like Robert Owen and the idea of labor time vouchers in place of commodity money. As a way, now labor time vouchers would be, you get paid for the time you put in, and that's a voucher. It's not money. You can't transfer it. You can't accumulate it, so you can make more vouchers out of vouchers, like money out of money, which is capital. You spend it like a theater ticket or a coupon, and you get back from the stores, in labor value what you put in. And Marx thought that was a good idea, but he mainly refrained from elaborating on that. He was more focused on criticizing capitalism, and also because the future was up to the people in the future. That was another thought in his mind. But I think today, given that we don't have such a clear idea, I think I mentioned Garl Perowitz. He talks about a checkerboard strategy where we do a lot of experimentation. We organize worker co-ops, community development corporations. We get hold of a city, we municipalize public power. Single payer health care in the state. And do a lot of things and prepare the ground for a more fundamental transformation. And I think, we got to think in those terms, but we also got to think concretely about what we're trying to create. And I would say there are 7 things that we can pose right now as reforms that prepare the ground for transitioning to a full socialist economy. And one of them is to fight for guaranteed economic human rights. Now, there's a section of this talk where I was going to say why the golden age of capitalism passed, why structurally it came from back to a New Deal kind of economy, basically because of the debt overhang, overaccumulation of capital, and financialization. It's all analysis. It would take 15 minutes, so I'm going to skip that. But, just take that as a premise. On the other hand, these are things that have majority support among the American people, like guaranteed health care, a single payer, improved Medicare for all system, like providing good public education for everybody, income support above the poverty line for those who can't work, a job guarantee so that if you can't find work in the private sector, you go to the government and say, where's my job? And they put you to work providing services and creating goods or public works that the community itself has determined they want. Things like affordable housing and mass transit. I'm going to submit a campaign on this that you can't have affordable housing without a massive increase in public housing. That's mixed income, not just for poor black folks. And Europe does this. 20 to 30% of their housing stock is publicly owned rental housing, and it's good quality housing. And because of that, the rest of the market is affordable. So those are things that we can raise. Now, I would argue that because big business has the power, they will always fight to roll that back. And in our political system, they have more power. On the other hand, to the extent we get those guarantees, working people have an exit option. They have more security. They can strike. They can leave an employer that's bad. They have more resources in which to, get engaged in political activity. So that's one area. Democratic ownership of public utilities. And of course, that's the natural monopolies, which, they're trying to privatize. Banking, at least as yardsticks. The Bank of North Dakota, even the Republicans love it. They couldn't touch that in that state. I mentioned energy, broadband. That's an area where the broadband utilities are, basically, when they're monopolistic position, denying services to those that have lower margins, like rural people or inner city people, and gouging the rest of us on prices. I think an area that's emerging are these monopolistic digital platforms, Google, Facebook, Amazon. The nature of those businesses is the more people get on them, the more other people want to get on because everybody's there. And there's more information on that platform. And they're basically becoming monopolies. They ought to be public utilities operated at cost for public benefit, not for private profit. And they are fast becoming the biggest players in the whole capitalist universe. Pensions. My pension got cut. I think it was a mistake in this country. We went to a private welfare state, basically unions negotiating that. It's a long story. It happened during World War II when there was a no-strike pledge. But that's an area. Military production and arms manufacturers. Why John Guinness Galbraith raised that, decades ago. And that's another area that's monopolistic. It's cost plus profiteering in the Pentagon, which we can't audit because there's so much corruption and fraud. And I think one thing came out of the New Left is the model for doing these public utilities is a federal model. So, like the National Health Service, the Dellums bill that came out of the Human Rights, what was it, the Civil Rights Committee, Human Rights. Anyway, the medics in the Civil Rights Movement, they came up with this model. And basically you have local districts elected by the workers and consumers who then send a rep to the regional or state system and the national system. So the detailed planning is at the local level. It's democratically accountable. And the regional or intermediate level, the state level, and the national level basically coordinate from decisions made below. And I think we should do the same thing with a Public Energy Corporation and other ones. So we have a more democratic model of public ownership, not the bureaucratic models we've seen both in the Eastern Europe countries and the social democratic so-called countries, England, Sweden, France, so forth, as well as in this country. We have state-owned or government-supported enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where the executives are living high off the hog and getting bailed out when they screw up, so their investors get bailed out. And, you need democratic accountability so you don't get ripped off. Land value taxation, the old Henry George idea. The idea here is you reduce rental incomes because, rental values come from location, and location is influenced by social investments. So if you're in the right place at the right time, your land appreciates in value through no doing of your own, just because you're in the right spot. Location, location, location. So those social investments should go to the public for the common good. That's the basic idea, and it would reduce rent, which also today gets financialized. So whatever rent values go up, the banks then leverage that as mortgages and they make interest off it. So that's where that money flows. That would reduce, the rental costs of living and doing business. It would be good for the economy and for living standards. So these are reforms that I think prepare the ground for socialism. Now, where the transition would come would be when we went from labor time accounting to labor time vouchers. And just basically say after a certain date, money's no good, everybody's going to get paid in vouchers. We no longer really have money that circulates. Owning an enterprise to get money doesn't make any sense. You're going to have to go to work to get your vouchers, aside from we would have some kind of basic income that everybody gets so that nobody's poor even if they can't work. And that would be a radical change. That's what Robert Owen proposed. That's what Marx talked about in the Critique of the GOTA program. There's been a whole lot of discussion in various socialist and anarchist currents as to how to do that. But I think that would be a radical change. So what I'm suggesting we need to start thinking about is labor time accounting, which kind of opens the window on exploitation and enables us to see how a rationally planned economy would be. And then the other part is democratic planning, which with modern computers, barcodes, microchips and things, the Internet of Things becomes much more practical than ever before. And big companies already do this. During World War II, 25% of production was planned. In fact, the capitalists and the top managers were getting scared because they were basically superfluous. We had civil servants doing what they had done and probably doing a better job of getting, the war product done. And they became very concerned about that, and part of the right-wing offensive grew out of that fear that they had at that time. And so, the labor vouchers would govern demand in real time because where people were spending their labor vouchers would tell you, with just-in-time production and delivery we have today, what needs to be produced. It's very feasible. There's some books on it I could refer you to by economists and computer scientists. So the other thing to make it democratic, and with our modern technology we can vote on this, is the planners would basically give us options defining levels of production that would meet certain consumer demands within that are sustainable ecologically. So we could vote on how much production consumption we want to have versus how much more free time. Basic technology decisions, like just to pick one that's already happened many decades ago, we were at a fork in the early 50s. We're going to go solar or nuclear. And the Truman set up the Paley Commission. It said, and they were concerned about oil supplies and whether we'd have to fight for them in the Middle East. This is after World War II, and whether we'd run out of oil. And they said we should go solar. But Eisenhower and the Pentagon said, no, we're going nuclear with the peaceful atom, kind of cover and provide production background for the atomic weaponry. The people didn't make that decision. That was made by state managers and capitalists. We could make those kind of decisions. And then the division of goods between a public sector where things are delivered free, to each according to their need, the old socialist ideal, like healthcare, education, using the roads and so forth, versus what you purchase with your labor vouchers. to each according to their labor, which is another ethic that has come out of the socialist tradition, which would, as Marx said, actually make bourgeois morality actually come to realization, because the idea in capitalism is you get a fair exchange, and with exploitation there isn't, but under this kind of economy there would be. Then the other piece of it, and I'm running up against my 15 minutes, is that, well, let me put it this way. When I was in '64, while I'm listening to people debate, whether we repeal fair housing and whether Democrats are going to seek freedom Democrats, these Goldwater people were saying very seriously, we're a republic, not a democracy, by which they meant we elect an elite to rule us. We don't make decisions ourselves because we're just the unruly mob. And when we talk about all the electoral forms, election, this goes back to Aristotle. Electing people to make decisions is an aristocratic model of government. It's not democratic. Back in Greek days, Athens was the model, the assembly of the people, even though it didn't include all people. And then they chose by lots those who would go to councils to execute decisions, except for election of generals who they felt they wanted to pick the competent people. I think we got to move that way. When we talk about grassroots democracy, that's what we need to talk about, and that's how we get, the real people involved in the political process. Because particularly under our system right now, the people that got connections to the money are the ones that get in. And so, look who's in Congress. It's not working class people. It's lawyers, businessmen, exterminators, Tom DeLay, crazy people. And then that whole discussion of reform and revolution, I would just say that we've had a lot of talk about it. Jill Stein says we need a revolution, but not much spelling out what it means. And I think we need to think in terms of transitional demands. Trotsky popularized this. Is actually coming out of the Communist International. These are demands that seem popular and common sense, like the right to a job, the job guarantee to everybody, the average people, but which is incompatible with capitalism because they want unemployed people to discipline workers and keep wages down. Andre Gordon, coming out of the 60s, called them non-reformist reforms because they push the system. And, he made very clear that what you're doing is creating a situation that creates a crisis. And at that point, you either got to move forward to the full program or you're going to get beaten back and lose. And I think, that's the way we need to think of it. I mean, Marx and Engels at one point thought in different writings that the US, the UK, France, and Holland could be transformed democratically through a parliamentary system. They weren't real positive about that, but they held it out as a possibility. I think, we got to go with the attitude we don't know, but we have a record in this country. I'm very skeptical of it. Whether it's, COINTELPRO going after Martin Luther King, let alone the Black Panthers, or Obama getting the mayors together with the Department of Homeland Security to shut down Occupy by force.
That's right.
Or overthrowing governments from Iran and Guatemala in the 50s, preventing elections in Vietnam, the Chilean coup, to the Honduran coup, which happened under Obama and Hillary Clinton's watch. The people that run this country really don't want democracy. So how do we counter that? We've got to be organized enough when they take their direct action, whether it's repressive military force or just investments like they did the Kucinich, we can counter with our own direct action. Strikes, occupations, backing up a progressive or socialist government that we elect with our own actions. And, that's, I think, key to that, which could open up a whole discussion on gun control, is you've got to win over the armed forces and the police. I went into the Marine Corps. I don't know, anybody watched a movie called The Spook Who Sat by the Door back in the early 70s? Okay, I'm going to wrap up on this point. The guy who was the black guy in Hogan's Heroes.
Ivan Dixon.
Ivan Dixon. Got some Hollywood producers to give him money to produce a black exploitation film. They didn't really look at the script, but it was about a black guy that joined the CIA to learn counterinsurgency so he could organize an insurgency. And a couple of my friends took me to see that in Roxbury. It only ran for like a week or two before producers found out what it was. You can get it by, digitally now. You can watch it.
What's it called?
The spook who sat by the door.
Say that again?
The spook who sat by the door.
Okay.
And so I was trying to figure out, do I go underground, change my name and fight the war that way? Do I go to Canada? I made arrangements for all that, but I finally decided I'd enlist in the Marine Corps, partly because family. I had parents fought in World War II, uncle, and 3 great-great-grandfathers who died on the Union side of the Civil War. And actually, we can trace one same ancestor to the American Revolution. And because I saw that movie. And the point was, in a revolution, we're not going to outgun this capitalist state, But the people with guns, we want to win them over, or at least enough of them, so we got a fighting chance. And if you look at modern revolutions, that's what happens. Same with the police. A lot of people say, oh, they're not really workers, they're agents of the man. Well, we got to divide them like we got to divide the armed forces. And I think it's worth having relationships with people in your police force that some of them do go in there with the right reasons. They're not all thugs. And that's important. And so, these are a lot of things, and I didn't get to my whole outline, that I think, while we are, running our candidates, raising these immediate demands, we need to be discussing and preparing for. And so in 2018 this year, we're going to try to raise some of these issues in our discussions, more in, smaller meetings with Greens, with groups on the left. And if we get asked if we're socialists, we've always said, yeah, and try to explain socialism extending democracy into the economy. Are you against that? That's the kind of response, and you get a discussion going. But it's not likely the media is going to carry that discussion. That's got to be done at the grassroots. So that's what we're going to try to do more of in 2018, because we're confident in getting the 50,000 votes. In 2014. We got 100,000 votes for our down-ticket statewide candidates. Basically, we figure half of Teachout's vote came to us, and that's why we got nearly 200,000 at the gubernatorial level. And then Jill Stein, and our Senate candidate that year, got about 100,000 votes in New York 2 years later. So we think that's our core vote. We want to, make sure we get that, and then, we'll try to get as many votes as we can. But this year, given the political climate, we'll have a hard time, I think, getting 5% again. But we can't get our ballot line. We can win local elections. I think the way we're going to build this party is elect people locally, they perform competently, then you can run for state and congressional seats. And when we have a caucus in Congress, then we can run a presidential candidate who MSNBC will, take seriously. So that's about where I think we're at. And let's have a discussion.